Take it, soldier, a gift from the Germans, as a keepsake. They bandaged the spot, handed me a slip of paper with a tent number on it, and instructed me to come back to rewrap my bandages in 3 days. I was happy because it seemed that I had gotten off lightly. In 3 days I would be back with my regiment. As I left the tent, I saw more and more wounded arriving. How did the doctors manage with such a mass of wounded? Later, as I watched them work, I realized that our own regiment commanders could learn a thing or two from the doctors' organization and selflessness. Most of the soldiers who have been in my spot would probably agree with this opinion. That first night, I collapsed on my bunk and immediately fell asleep. The tent was loaded to the maximum with wounded. Snoring, conversations, the moans and cries of pain, motion. The wounded were constantly getting up, some to relieve themselves, others to have a smoke or get a bit of fresh air. All this was going on around me, but I didn't notice any of it. I slept soundly until they woke me up in the morning and called me to eat. The next morning I returned to my favourite observation post, the stump from the evening before. I now knew that our 1st Rifle Company of the 1st Battalion of the 711th Rifle Regiment no longer existed. Of the 136 officers and men in the unit before the battle, only about 8 privates remained. The rest were all killed or wounded. Our company commander, Senior Lieutenant Sukhomirov, was killed. The commissar was badly wounded by a shell fragment and sent to a field hospital. Of the 3 platoon leaders, 2 had been killed in action. The fate of the battery of 45S, 45mm anti-tank guns, in which I had briefly served, was also tragic. The artillerymen had rolled their guns forward with the infantry. Junkers had deluged the men and their guns alike with bombs. Many were killed. I learned about this from, who would believe it, Osip Osipovich, the battery's sergeant major, who told me about it with tears in his eyes. Wounded by a shell splinter in the buttocks, he had somehow managed to get off the battlefield and was now lying on his stomach, pitifully groaning, waiting to be sent to a hospital. Someone told me that our cook had waited a long time for the return of our company, and that he had kept the abundant meal, which our company commander had ordered for the surviving men, warm for hours. A lot of time passed, but nobody returned. The cook, understanding what had happened, started to cry and refused to touch any of the meal he had prepared. However, the sergeant major, whom Shirka had so despised, calmly ate 2 portions of the cooling soup, 2 portions of the porridge, and collapsed in sleep, filling the forest with his repulsive grunts and snoring. Seeing a few familiar faces, I tried to find out what was happening at the front, and whether or not we had taken the villages. The majority of the wounded answered my questions indifferently. In response, they typically just turned around and walked away or moved on without stopping. But one soldier, a little older than the others, told me, "We took just what we were supposed to take, and now you're seeing for yourself, son, how many of us are maimed and mutilated." After that, I didn't press anybody for information, as I understood they simply weren't in the mood for it. Delving further into the forest, I came upon another large, almost rectangular clearing with operating tents. Trucks carrying the badly wounded were driving up, and orderlies were carefully unloading the trucks and tenderly carrying the wounded on stretchers to the edges of the clearing. They laid the stretchers around the perimeter in a single row. They didn't have enough stretchers, so they used tent canvas to carry some of the wounded. There was a doctor on duty, a nurse, and a few orderlies. Together they examined all the incoming patients. A few wounded men were immediately driven away to the field hospital, which meant they needed a complex operation, a head, chest, or abdominal wound. Bloody work continued around the clock in the operating tents. The medical team cut off arms and legs, set dislocated jaws and broken bones, and thought up different ways to reconstruct faces, ears, noses, hands, and feet. But even here, men were often dying, primarily from gangrene and tetanus. The soldier is filthy, lice-ridden, and then gets wounded. Of course, they were given tetanus shots, but often it was too late. When blood supplies ran out, the doctors, nurses, and orderlies themselves became blood donors. The Medsanbat's pharmacy was meagre. Wounds, as a rule, were treated with hydrogen peroxide, iodine, Rivanol, and sometimes Vishnevsky ointment. They didn't have enough anesthetics, so they would use opium, of which the doctors had plenty, to relieve severe pain. I saw that even here, a hard, not always successful struggle with death went on. I saw bitter tears flowing, torrents of blood, and cruel scenes of human torment playing out. Here there were no false or imaginary sufferings. Here everyone was both a hero and a sufferer. I will tell you about one operation I witnessed. The doctor had to remove a soldier's leg urgently. Gangrene had set in. They tied the poor fellow tightly to the operating table with strips of sheeting, gave him a couple of shots of vodka, and then began to saw. In a semi-delirium, the man cried, hollered and thrashed, while the orderly tried to hold him still. The doctor kept saying, "That's it, dear man! Yell, yell, and swear to your heart's content!" Opening his eyes, the soldier began to tremble uncontrollably when he saw his own leg in a basket next to him. "Give me back my leg!" he suddenly implored in desperation. He was in shock from the pain. I asked permission to help the medical orderlies and spent all day going around the wounded men, giving them sips of water, bathing their faces and hands, and helping them shift to more comfortable positions. I was not allowed to touch any medicines. Nurses handled this. Primarily, they gave the wounded the timeless aspirin, a frontline wonder. Trucks delivered the next batch of wounded. Stretchers were placed on the ground. 2 severely wounded men wound up side by side. Taking a glance at each other, they gave a gasp. 2 natural brothers had just been reunited. Everyone lying around them had to laugh when they overheard the ensuing conversation. "Is that you, Serega? You're not dead, brother?" "I'm alive, Ivan." "Where did you manage to get hit?" "Some German bastard shot me in the shoulder. I don't know if they're going to be able to save my arm. Where did you get it?" "I took a shell splinter in the arm. Where did you come from in order to wind up here?" "From that other world, Vanya. I spent all night lying in the field. I had resigned myself to my death. Thank God some orderlies found me the next morning and dragged me back into this world. And I'm back from that other world too, Serega. Blood was flowing from me like from a leaky bucket. God took mercy on this peasant. Some medical orderlies dragged me back to the living. But how are things there, brother, in the afterlife? Who did you see? Who did you knock around with?" "It's better on this earth, Vanya. I've just met my brother. It had to be. What joy for Mama. We're still alive." A genuine show proceeded from that point. "But did you see our dear cow, that milk cow?" "Of course, Brother Ivan. Our cow recognized me. Our little milk factory treated me to some fresh milk." "Go on with you. And did you notice our dog, Juchka?" Naturally, Juchka as well. Just as he lived without any brains on this earth, he was being just as foolish a dog there." "Well, and Rizzy, your cat, what's he doing up there?" There they explained that chasing mice is forbidden in heaven. The cat was assigned a new job, chief fly fighter. For every 10,000 swatted flies, a prize. Never mind, he's getting by. On Earth he had a reputation as a clever creature, and there they recognize him as a clever creature too. And he recognized me. He licked me all over and purred. "Yeah, fortune smiled upon you, Serega." No matter how much pain they were feeling, aching, piercing, squeezing their chests, or nauseating them, everyone was cheered up by the 2 brothers. What creative fellows! Such jokers! The wounded all laughed. Subsequently, I took an interest in Serega's fate. They managed to save his arm and sent him to convalesce in a field hospital. The second night in the Medsanbat was hard for me. At first I fell fast asleep, but then suddenly dreams came. And what dreams? What was it? Nighttime play of the imagination, the echo of terrifying impressions, otherworldly spirits raging. The remainder of the night turned into a nightmare for me. Fantastic images held me tightly in their power, forcing me to suffer alongside them, to be happy, to cry, to shudder in horror. With his father's sword in a gilded saddle, wearing a tall Cossack sheepskin hat, he is galloping across the battlefield on a majestic grey steed. Not a single bullet touches him, and here they are, the bandits' trenches. Shirka unsheathes his sword and is slicing off head after enemy head. Now our troops have already occupied the emptied trenches and are rushing off in pursuit of the cowardly fleeing enemy. "For the holy Russian land!" the Cossack swordsman Shirka is shouting, and he spurs his horse after the enemy, continuing to slice off heads. The Germans are falling to their knees and praying, their eyes looking up to heaven, beseeching God to spare them from this human devil. Victory! Rzhev is ours! Word of the superhero saviour reaches legendary proportions, and even the High Command hears of it. The Supreme Leader has demanded that the Russian Wonder Bogatyr, epic Russian hero of yore, be brought before him, so he could see the hero for himself. Shirka steps out of his tent, in his Cossack sheepskin hat, with his father's sword in its gilded scabbard. He leaps onto his grey-coated horse and gallops off, chasing the wind, to meet the Supreme Commander and the High Command. "Where did you get those, hero?" the Supreme Leader asks Shirka, pointing at the 4 stars on his shoulder straps. "What sort of highest decoration are you seeking now?" But Shirka, who is also a brazen fellow, spits, swears, and declares, "The rivers have implored, the Russian earth itself, soaked with its soldiers' blood, has begged, and the Supreme Being has ordered me to put an end to your disgraceful generalship. The way you are conducting the fight is totally bringing our entire Christian nation to ruin." The Supreme Commander becomes enraged and stamps his box-calf boots. "Seize the insubordinate, tie the recalcitrant up, shoot him to teach others never to play the hero like this again. But you don't mess around with someone like Shirka." At first, a group of soldiers with submachine guns surrounds him, but then, recognizing their own daring Cossack, they immediately toss down their weapons and cry, "We won't shoot our saviour, our holy hero legend." And with that, Shirka, unsheathing his father's sword, immediately cuts off the foul heads of the High Command scandal. The Red Army had never known such a disgrace in its entire history. Just then, Osobisti from the Special Department appeared, seeking to make short work of Shirka. They seize the hero on the spot and tie him up. They toss him into a front-line prison, a deep, deep pit. But the dishonourable men have forgotten about his loyal steed. Sensing trouble for his master, the horse gallops to the rescue and tramples all the offenders. Shirka the Cossack leaps out of the pit and onto his grey horse, and gallops off into the distance, beyond the clouds. I woke up in the middle of the night. It took me a painfully long time to wake up fully. At last I hopped to my feet. I thought I was still lying on my bunk. In reality, I had long before fallen to the floor, and I'd been thrashing around there, dishevelled, soaked in sweat, with a troubled head. I climbed back into my bunk, where I looked into the darkness and began calling for Shirka, summoning him. If only he was here with me. Instead of Shirka, a neighbouring patient stepped over to my bunk, and with a shaking hand he offered me a cup of water. "Here, drink a little water, soldier. It will ease your mind. You were groaning so loudly, calling for some Shirka, remembering your friend, I suppose. Time will pass, and we'll both start remembering together. As for him, a big debt of gratitude. This damned war, those damned Germans." Waking up again in the morning, it took me a long time to remember where I was and what was happening with me. Breakfast had still not been delivered. Without waiting for it, I left for the forest to lend more help to the wounded. And in the operating tents in the clearing that day, a genuine miracle occurred. 2 doctors and 2 military sappers made it happen. Usually the trucks arriving with the wounded were loaded with as many as they could carry. Suddenly, however, a truck transporting a single wounded man arrived. He was carefully placed on a stretcher and gently lowered to the ground. Evidently, he had been expected. Obviously, this was a special case. Personnel gathered, a hospital chief, another doctor, and for some reason military sappers with all their gear. It was becoming clear that something quite extraordinary had happened. Nurses and medical orderlies bustled about. What only doesn't happen in war? Apparently, a small shell, fired from a company mortar, had struck the man from behind, below the waist, and was lodged there. Having penetrated his uniform, it somehow quickly expended all its energy once it entered his body, and now it was stuck there, with only its stabilizing fins visible protruding from his flesh. Fortunately for him, for some reason the fuse hadn't worked, but you couldn't envy the injured man, who had unexpectedly received such a gift. The soldier was lying on his stomach, quietly enduring his fear and pain. His face was covered with perspiration and had darkened from heart troubles. Fearing to move even a tiny bit, he had become as taut as a string, shivering as if a stroke was running down his body. Everyone was worried that the fuse might trigger the explosive charge at any minute, when everyone would be blown to pieces, both the soldier and those working to save him. All the doctors and nurses were led out of their operating tents. They cordoned off the clearing, letting no one near the scene. The chief of the Medsunbat, an experienced combat surgeon who was a graduate of the Leningrad Combat Medical Academy, himself took on the unique operation to remove the mortar shell while getting advice from the sappers. A young volunteer doctor assisted him. The entire Medsunbat froze in place. The gazes of the doctors and the wounded, the soldiers' telegraph had already spread the news, were fixed upon the operating tent where the procedure was taking place. The operation lasted about an hour. To everyone's great joy, it ended successfully. The sappers, in a flash, removed the fuse from the mortar round. The doctors also then had to deal with a task no less complicated. They extracted the shell from the body. This was a small miracle, and then stopped the bleeding. Everybody around gave a sigh of relief. A few people even shouted, "Ura!" and everyone applauded the doctors and sappers. The division's newspaper soon had an article about this amazing story, the author of which informed us of the soldier's further fate. He had been sent to a field hospital since the shell, which didn't damage any internal organs, had brought with it a serious infection. When the tension subsided and everyone returned to their normal business, I happened to notice 2 wounded officers who were lying on stretchers far removed from the others. On one of them, I immediately recognized Sabit Kalikov, the regiment's comsorg. I rushed over to him. "Sabit! Fancy finding you here! What's with you?" "A typical story for a Komsomol organizer," he said softly. "The Commissar ordered us to rally the fighting men and lead them forward, but the German machine guns weren't letting us raise our heads, so we didn't reach their lines, and a shell fragment shattered my hip." Glancing at my bandaged neck, he asked, "How are you? Are you badly wounded?" "Nonsense," I said cheerfully. "Just a scratch from a shell fragment. I hope to get back to my regiment soon. How glad I am to see you. How can I help you?" Sabit closed his eyes, either from the pain or because he had fallen into thought. His face, unshaven, filled with pain, had darkened a little. I constantly sponged his brow and gave him a little drink of water. Then suddenly he spoke up, speaking very quickly, probably fearing that orderlies would walk up, carry him away, and he wouldn't have time to finish what he wanted to tell me. "You can help me a lot if you listen carefully to everything I have to say." I nodded. "You remember how we parted? Well, so, your transfer to the battery was the doing of the regiment's party organizer. The swine, the anti-Semite. He demanded that you be sent into the ranks and accused me, he said, of sheltering you in the political section. Let your little Jew do some fighting. I've been wanting a long time to tell you about this, but I never had a chance. I was ready to lay down my life for it myself. But what sort of nobility is it, tell me, if the commander and commissar issue the order at any cost? That means the soldier must pay. But they haven't prepared him and haven't armed him as they should. It's insanity. This is the 2nd year we've been fighting atop the bones of our own men." I was silent, shaken by Sabit's unexpectedly harsh words. The 359th Medical Sanitation Battalion. "I can see that I've spoiled your mood, admit it." "Yes." I wanted to swallow a little more air. "I'm right. You should get rid of your illusions as quickly as possible." My thoughts were jumbled, racing. Perhaps I didn't understand or didn't even know all the circumstances. What did he want me to do? Maybe he'd gone too far. That mustn't be. Probably he was trying to curb my lofty patriotic ardour. But we had to fight the Germans, even despite the stupidity and ineptitude of our command. The wise Komsomol organizer understood my thoughts without any words spoken. "Hey, how green you still are! I thought more of you. You're hurrying back to the regiment? But stop and think, your regiment no longer exists." He was right. Years later I found out that after 2 months of the offensive, of the 3,000 personnel in the ranks of the 711th Rifle Regiment, only 200 officers and men remained. From the first day I had met him, Sabit had always seemed to me to be an honest, direct individual, the finest example of an army political worker. Yet now I couldn't regain my equilibrium. His words had stunned me, and each one had been driven into my brain like a nail, tormenting me. Did this mean that Janechka's and Shurka's deaths had been for nothing? And Sukhomirov's? And the suffering of the wounded? The doctors, too. Were their efforts for no purpose? Did this mean all of this was in vain? Pulling myself together, I eventually said, "Not all of our commanders and commissars are like that. I don't consider my own division commander to be like that. If only you had known Sukhomirov, my company commander, you wouldn't have talked like that. You know, he—" I had to hurry, for orderlies were approaching us. "You've forgotten the most important thing, Sabit. We must drive out the Germans. You know this too. Everything else is secondary to this." He didn't have time to answer me, as the orderlies had reached us. We quickly exchanged kisses on the cheek, and they carried him off toward an operating tent. Helping the wounded, I often glanced at the operating tent where they had taken Sabit. The conversation didn't leave me, and I kept turning it over in my mind, trying to understand it, and the motives of the regimental Komsomol organizer. The Komsorg was supposed to encourage and inspire men to fight, not advise them to duck out of battle. What should I do? Should I follow his advice and try to live a bit longer? Was he trying to protect and save me? Had his severe wound and everything he had seen and suffered on the battlefield changed his thinking about the war? I knew Sabit as a good and always life-loving man with a kind disposition, an optimist, and now suddenly he was speaking maliciously. Perhaps his faith in basic human decency and his principles had collided against those he could no longer tolerate, and finding himself in shock, he was unable to restrain himself, and he had spilled everything to me. Had all this been building inside him for a long time? I recalled Yurka Davidov and his criticism of the commanders, but Sabit was no Yurka. He was older, more serious and deeper. But now the choice was mine to make. Should I agree with him? Just like that, on the fly, change my own convictions and become a different man? But what if I did? Who tolerates criticism of army orders? Especially at the front, in an operational army. I had already been expelled from the ranks of the Komsomol organizers, and then out of the artillery. Sabit's operation lasted almost 4 hours. But at last, an orderly stepped out of the tent, supporting a pale nurse with difficulty, and he carefully laid her on the grass. Fearing for Sabit, I rushed up to the orderly. "What's the matter? What happened?" "With your friend, it seems, everything is fine," he comforted me. "It's just that this young lady inhaled some chloroform, and she passed out." A week later, Sabit was transferred to a field hospital, and from there to a hospital in Kazan. In the autumn of 1946, I located Sabit and invited him to visit. Our family was living then in an overcrowded communal apartment with 3 other families. Altogether, 14 people were living in this humble abode. My parents, Mama's sister and I lived together in an 18-square-metre room, but in the first post-war year, our room became a shelter for many of my former frontline comrades. At the front, I had given them my address, and now, returning from the war to various corners of the country, they were travelling through Moscow and stopped at our place. Mama refused no one her hospitality, joyfully received everyone, fed them, and arranged a place for them to sleep on the floor, as there was no other spot to give them. When my father and aunt returned home from work in the evening, everybody, masters and guests of the house, would seat themselves around our round table under a large, colourful lampshade. There we would wolf down Mama's tasty meals, which she had prepared from the simplest ingredients, and offer toasts to the very best mother in the world. Mamma would gaze with loving eyes at the stately fine fellows in their faded field blouses, decorated with combat orders, medals, and the narrow little red and yellow ribbons denoting combat wounds. By the end of the war, I encountered officers and soldiers who had been wounded up to 10 times. Mamma asked each visitor to talk as much as possible about himself, his combat actions, and, of course, me, and she listened to each man with reverence. About 15 frontline veterans spent time with our family in this way. We hosted Sabit as well. After his wounding, for the rest of his life, he walked with a cane dot. That evening, after Sabit's operation, I returned to my tent late for dinner. Picking at some cold porridge left for me by the guys, I sat on my bunk and pondered the night ahead, fearing the next unanticipated dream, and, no matter how strange it might seem, trying to make sense of my dream about Shirka from the night before and all its haunting images. Had it been an omen, a good one, or a bad one? What was lying in wait for me tonight, and when would it appear? Everyone can ponder dreams that he or she likes, but I had the feeling that this dream had been some sort of prompting. I should change something or act somehow differently in the future, but how? Recalling what I had seen, I tried to assemble it into one complete picture. But what was its essence? Without undressing, I collapsed onto my bunk, but just in case, I asked the on-duty nurse for some kind of sedative. She brought me several white tablets. I gulped them down and peacefully fell lightly asleep. However, close to morning, another vision crept into my sleeping head, even more vividly than the previous nights. A pair of eyes lit up in the darkness with a phosphorescent glow. Janechka's eyes. Large, widened, he was gazing directly at me. In them was one question: why? His gaze seemed somehow embarrassed, but the eyes are flashing, disappearing and reappearing. Janechka speaks. "I'm ashamed that I died. People are falling into a bloody river and drowning." Tormenting memories began to flash through my mind. The barracks and Janechka. The rail car. They are beating Janechka. Janechka is in my arms. He is saying something. Suddenly, an enormous black bird spreads itself above me. Its wings widespread, it has frozen in place. It transfixes me totally with an intent gaze. I try to move, to catch sight of light, and I cannot. I'm a prisoner. I'm tightly clenched and all rigid. It is impossible to free myself, and I'm patiently waiting for something to happen. The bird suddenly takes on a human voice. "Did you promise Janechka to find me and his little sister Sashenka?" "Yes, absolutely. But it's impossible for me now." "I am releasing you from useless torments and searches. We no longer exist. The Germans killed us in a Crimean quarry. Jania didn't know about this. He was looking for you to his final day. Are you his mother?" "I'm your dream." And everything vanished. The dream disappeared. I woke up. Perhaps the apparitions never even existed. I closed my eyes. Would I suddenly see something again? Nothing. I leapt from my bunk and nearly knocked a nurse off her feet. She had been standing beside my bunk, observing me with alarm as I tossed and turned in my dream. "What's your problem, soldier? You were shouting so loudly you weren't giving anyone a chance to sleep. That's forbidden. You must restrain yourself and calm down." "Yes, thank you," I agree. After breakfast, I go to have my dressings changed. They uncover the wound. It is heavily suppurating. They clean it and then apply another dressing with Rivanol. The doctor shakes his head and directs me to a convalescent battalion. All 3 days I spent at the Medsanbat were 3 days among warm-hearted, caring people. The entire staff of the Medsanbat was totally dedicated to us, the frontline soldiers. Recalling now everything that I experienced and saw during the days and years of the war, I know. I will never forget those people, nor their selflessness and loyalty to duty. Combat situation, battalions of convalescents are under the command of the divisional Medsanbat. Normally, they didn't keep patients long in these battalions. Instead of the typical 2 weeks here, I had to spend more than a month living according to the special regime for convalescents. My wound continued to suppurate, and the infection was spreading. By the evening of my first day in the convalescent battalion, I was becoming feverish. The thermometer had risen by 2 or 3 marks. The doctor kept stating the obvious. "The fragment induced a serious infection. You need more time." Each time after rebandaging my wound, the nurse would promise, "Well, next time it will get better." But the wound didn't heal. Rivanol was a weakling in the struggle with the bacteria. The convalescent battalion was located in a once large village 3 or 4 kilometers from the Medsanbat. The village had long been deserted. The men had been conscripted into the Red Army. Some had been killed in action back in 1941. The women had been deported to Germany for slave labour. There were also those who followed the retreating German forces, while old people and little children had been evacuated from the combat zone, first by the Germans when they seized the village, then by our forces once we liberated it. The battalion unit was accommodated in the 3 huts that had survived intact. A medical station and rebandaging station occupied one of the huts, where the doctor, nurse, and medical orderlies also lived. The wounded were kept in the other 2 huts. There were approximately 20 patients in our hut. About 300 meters from the village, deep bomb shelters had been built, just in case. After each new battle, about 200 additional men arrived in the battalion, and although approximately the same number would return to active duty at the same time, the battalion was badly overcrowded. Therefore, some of the patients were housed in empty German dugouts or in tents in the woods. It was fortunate that the weather was still relatively warm and the patients were of the convalescing type. That is to say, they were still mobile under their own power, meaning they could walk to the mess hall. The daily routine was as follows. After breakfast, we had a period of so-called light combat training, then lunch, political classes, and 3 hours of free time. Twice a week, we all underwent medical examinations. The command was under pressure to discharge more patients, and they didn't stand on ceremony with the patients, often discharging them before they were fully healed. The doctors considered it most important to stop any infections and to put arms and legs back in working order. Once, there was a scandal. A senior nurse of the battalion overheard a conversation between the division's chief of staff and the chief of the Medsanbat. The former accused the latter. "Each soldier in your care is authorized to be here, as are all the officers, but you are acting too sentimentally." The chief of the Medsanbat made no effort to respond, and simply sent a commission to investigate the situation. The commission of 3 doctors worked for 2 days, closely examining everyone. As a result, 21 soldiers and 3 officers were returned to the front. A senior lieutenant, who had lost his left arm and had an empty sleeve instead, commanded the battalion for convalescence. His name was Sergei Ivanovich Tokmakov. After his severe wounding and long recovery in a hospital, he had refused an offer of discharge and somehow managed to secure another assignment at the front. As a commander, he was brave and decent, always trying to support us. He took care of the timely delivery of our food, ensured the regular redressing of wounds, and made sure letters and newspapers were delivered. He also conducted our combat training exercises, albeit in a lighter style. He spent most of the time simply discussing frontline experiences, asking each man about shortcomings in their units, and offering advice on how to eliminate them in the future. The chief of the division's Medsanbat had under his personal command a sergeant major and a medical assistant, who helped him manage the battalion's operations. The sergeant major, my 5th by count, Foka Stepanich, had been a medical orderly. He loved order and discipline, so the patients called him OD. He paid particular attention to the schedule of our morning reveille and evening retreat. He also inspected our quarters. If he saw that they were messy, noticed dirty dishes, a dirty floor, or came across any unshaven soldiers, he would always try to find the right way to motivate each man. Then he would deliver his lecture, concluding it with a kindly question. "Do you agree with me?" He was the first sergeant major I encountered who addressed us formally, obviously following the example of his commanding officer. If the soldier agreed, the sergeant major firmly believed the man would take corrective action. We particularly appreciated the Sergeant Major when he contrived to build a rudimentary shower for us. He planted 4 sturdy posts into the ground, wrapped them with tent canvas, and suspended a bucket with narrow holes drilled into it above the enclosed space. One man would pour water into the bucket while another man showered. The wounded men could walk around clean, and they were quite pleased. In the middle of our hut stood a large, solidly built table made by some village craftsman. Obviously, a large family had once lived there. Every morning, an important ritual took place around this table. Together with breakfast, the field kitchen would deliver loaves of bread in large, heavy bags. The loaves were all of the same size, about 1 kilogram each, and each table in the battalion received 15 loaves. While we all remained outside, one particular soldier with an easy stroke of a sharp knife would slice each loaf into 2 portions as evenly as possible. Everyone marvelled at the faultless eye of the man who did the slicing. It turned out that he was a sniper. Then 5 men would be invited into the hut at a time. Each would stand with his back to the table and call out a number to receive his share. I don't recall anyone ever rejecting this method of dividing the bread. They say this system of allocating bread among frontline soldiers was adopted everywhere. I think I won't be mistaken if I suppose that this system came to the army from the prison camps. Once, the Germans, upon seeing us divide bread this way, shouted from their trenches, "Rus, stop dividing up the portions and let's fight!" On the 2nd or 3rd day of my stay in the convalescent battalion, a young chap of enormous size burst into our hut, his face grizzled like a bear's. But we immediately recognized each other. "Rizhi, it's you! Greetings, Cadet Alexander Rizhikov!" We embraced joyfully at the meeting. We went outside, took a seat on a log by a fence, and Sashka told me about himself. A bullet had caught him in his very first fight, striking him in the arm. It didn't smash the bone, but it had torn out a solid chunk of muscle tissue and burned his skin. "I almost lost my arm, but that threat passed. Only now it's slowly rotting. Comrade Rivenol isn't helping." We chuckled merrily. "But where's your guitar?" I asked. "I didn't take it into battle with me. I left it back with the transport unit." "Perhaps you'll sing a little for us tonight. Everyone will be happy." "Perhaps," Rizhi agreed. We talked about our families and where different members were located. I told him about the deaths of Janechka and Shuka. Rizhi named off a few more: Sasha Pushkarev, Yulik Gertz, Serezha Kozhevnikov, Fedenka. They were all dead. I didn't like Fedenka back in the barracks, and I couldn't forgive his underhanded snitching in return for little jellied candies. But all the same, I was sorry for the fellow. He died in a terrible manner. His company was trying to force a crossing of the Volga, and the Germans were resisting desperately, trying to drive our guys back across the river. Fedor died while making the crossing. Whether a German bullet caught him, or whether he couldn't hang on to the cable stretched across the river, Fedor slipped beneath the currents and never reappeared. The first battles had painted a mournful picture. Who among us had imagined it would be this way? We had barely started our combat paths. Were they really going to slaughter us all? But nevertheless, everyone had passed the test of our character. I don't know a single incident where one of our cadets cowered or acted badly. But with each passing day and new encounter, I was becoming convinced that fate was not ours to determine, that something higher was deciding it. That evening, Raiji came by our hut. I introduced him to everyone. Then he sang 3 popular songs: In Our City, The Song of the Black Raven, and, of course, The Gal from the Little Tavern, the crowning jewel of our pre-war folk songs. The audience greeted each song with a hurrah. We laid out some refreshments on the table, each man contributing what he could, and without any embarrassment, Raiji wolfed it all down in succession. Obviously, he was famished. As he was singing The Gal from the Little Tavern, Battalion Commander Tokmakov stepped into the hut. The senior lieutenant liked Raiji's singing, but when it was finished, he observed, "Nowadays, lad, they're singing different songs." And he recited the words from a popular frontline song taken from a poem by Yaroslav Smeliakov. "We must sing some song with sense, for between each line, both German shell fragments, and bullets from their bunkers fly. Yes, the time for other songs had arrived. It was impossible not to agree with that. We invited Raisi, who had taken his seat among us, to move into our hut. 50 convalescing wounded would have to stuff themselves into one room for the political education classes. They sat on broad window sills, in doorways, and on the floor. The commissar turned out to be a very irritable man, as temperamental as the devil, and I never met a windbag who was his equal. He conducted the classes in his own unique style. Asking a question, he would immediately answer it, often citing Stalin's speeches. His stupidity was striking. Once someone asked him, "Why have we not been able to take Rzhev for such a long time?" The question was disagreeable to the commissar, but he quickly gathered himself and calmly replied, "The Supreme Commander does not hide the fact that the Germans are stubbornly resisting, but it is necessary to understand that they are defending this way because of their desperation and their fear of retribution for the crimes they have committed." After this incident, the commissar turned to new tactics in leading his classes. He didn't allow himself to be interrupted, and he tried to fill up the allotted time precisely with his own talking, at which point he would quickly leave. Meanwhile, I could sense that a dark cloud of bitter and frightening questions was accumulating in every man's mind. Who could we ask about the enormous losses, and how? Why weren't they burying our dead? Why wasn't our air force covering the ground forces? Why were our artillerymen unable to cope with the task of suppressing the enemy's firing positions? What was happening in the rear? Why were letters from home filled with a terrible inconsolability? And what about the ferocious conduct of many commanders, commissars, and the special department? Why was the average soldier saying more often, "Don't fear the other side, fear our own"? These were questions without answers. Some were afraid to ask them. They were aware that they'd be reported. Others didn't believe they would get honest answers. One wise soldier said, "What kind of truth are you expecting if that same commander or commissar is certain that one of his own from the special department is among his audience?" It turned out that we didn't much trust anyone else, or even ourselves. Of course, there were also those who didn't want to argue with anyone, adhering to the old rule, "You can't fight a cannon with a pea-shooter." But nonetheless, it was hard for the men to remain silent all the time, and the soldiers did talk among themselves. Here, in the battalion of convalescents, I received another lesson from the military university, perhaps the most important, a human one. Among us there were soldiers from various regiments and batteries, but mostly there were new conscripts. It soon became clear why there were so many of them among the wounded in the battalion. They had been brought from Penza one night, disembarked from the rail cars, and that same morning, off the march, they were driven to assault a hill. Clerks hadn't even had time yet to write their names on the roster, and the cooks hadn't fed them a meal. In military matters they were complete know-nothings, as they had trained for less than a month by that time. An enormous number of them were killed and wounded in the attack. From then on, whenever they delivered a new batch of conscripts, we would say, "They've come from Penza." How many of them fell in their first actions, it is impossible to reckon. Night approaches, no one can sleep. At first, complete silence reigns. Each man is absorbed in his own thoughts. Then suddenly, like the first tiny rivulet of spring, somebody speaks up, and then stories fill the air. They often talk of the past, each man remembering something cheerful. How can he not talk about his home, his mistress of the house, his little ones, or his milk cow, who provided the whole village with fresh milk at the same time? Recollecting his past life, whether for the first, second, or 100th time, a man always finds something new, joyous, and heartwarming. But the frontline impressions. Each man had already accumulated so many, especially when you consider that many of the men who wound up in the battalion had started their combat journey at Moscow in 1941. One recounts when he became regarded as an experienced scout. From his very first mission, when, having snuck into a German trench, he managed to snatch a Wachtmeister, a German non-commissioned officer rank, literally master sentinel, who was as plump as a ham. After that he was no longer green. Another man can never forget how his division commander kissed him twice on the cheek and awarded him the For Courage medal, There was no one better who could knock out a German bunker with just 1 or 2 rounds. And how could a man resist relating the following story? A commander sent a soldier to fetch the mail. There the soldier met not some bullying postal clerk, but a sweet young woman, a darling like no other. But no matter how the soldier tried to charm her, no matter what lofty words he spoke, no matter how much he flashed his For Courage medal, in general, no matter what frontal or flank assault he tried, he couldn't break through the defences of the woman's heart. On his way back, he thought up every sort of ruse to convince his commander to return him that evening to the mail service. And the commander sent him, for he himself was badly longing to receive word from his parents in besieged Leningrad. And the soldier, such a persistent fellow, managed to achieve his real aim and win the heart of his beloved. As is evident, there often comes a time in conversation, a moment of real candour and trust, when a person bares his or her soul, when one wants to speak freely, easily, without worrying about any sharp rebuke or ugly consequence to his words. And really, who knows, we might be living our last days on earth. 4 soldiers in the convalescent battalion had already been wounded twice, and one says, "God spared me, but whether the Lord will show me mercy a 3rd time, I don't know." And so an interminable soldier's talk starts and flows, and I cannot recall a case when anyone refused to take part. You don't often encounter in life, if you will, such sincerity, truthfulness, self-searching, heartfelt emotions, and striving to understand others. It's such a pity that I've forgotten many of these oral gold mines. We were launching direct attacks, upon some village. Which village? Who the hell knows which village? Only a few charred skeletons remained of its former dwellings. Instead of going around the village and hitting the fascists from the rear, our company commander sent us straight up the middle toward the village, right into their machine guns. But the Fritz is no fool. He let us get a little closer, and then started to cut us to pieces. Within a half hour, he cut down almost an entire battalion, including our company commander. There's no point in feeling sorry for him. He's always been a total fool. But I feel sorry for the guys. "But that village, did you take it?" A voice rings out in the darkness. We took it. But if we must sacrifice a battalion for every village, how will we ever reach Germany? Here's what I think. A commander must use his brains, and perhaps then he'll be more useful. At this point, evidently, a signaller enters the conversation. But what's the point of him thinking when he's planned everything beforehand, and during the battle there's some foul-up with the communications? Everybody knows that the German reptiles focus their fire on us signallers. They recognize us by our spools of wire and even send snipers to take us out. They kill one signaller and wait for another to crawl out, and then they kill that one too. All the same, when your turn comes next, you must start crawling in search of the break until you catch the sound of chamomile to squirrel. Over. Sometimes even worse things happen. Once the regiment commander sent me out to find a battalion whose signalman wasn't responding. I crawled for a long time under enemy fire, and I was so scared. I didn't dare lift my head and ploughed a path with my nose. Then I happened to bump directly into a machine gunner from the battalion. I felt such a sense of relief, and I asked him, "Where's the battalion?" This guy says to me, "What? Battalion? What? Can't you see? Here's the battalion for you." And he gave a little jerk with his head. I lifted my head a little, and all around me are piles of our dead. The machine gunner shouted, "I'm the only one left. Get going, get back to the regiment, give your report, and tell them to send me some help. The Fritzes want to take me alive. I'll never surrender to them, the swine. Once they get past me, they're going to keep rolling. Do you understand?" So I think the infantryman is right. We don't know how to fight as we should, using our brains. Perhaps the German generals will teach us. Someone rudely snaps at the soldier. "You, Vaska, shut your trap. You yourself know what happens to people who talk like that." A tanker steps into the conversation. That's exactly right. Infantry are nothing without tanks. Some infantrymen react to his remark. What use are you? The tanks do their own thing, while the infantry does its own thing. No, comrade tankist, we don't even know each other yet. How should I interpret your words? The tanker offers in protest. Like this, sounds a whole chorus of voices. While you try to make your way to the German trenches, either you're bogged down up to your drive sprocket in some swamp, or you've thrown a track in some ditch, or the Junkers are scattering you around the field, like matches flung from a matchbox. Your guns quickly fall silent. You've run out of ammunition. An artilleryman intervenes. You're worthless infantry. Give some help to our spotters, because without them, what kind of support can you get? What can you guys do without us? It is well known that the artillery is the god of battle. If we only had some more shells, we'd open a path to Berlin. There you go. The Germans are rolling in ammunition for their artillery, while we're lucky if you've managed to scrape together 10 shells for your gun. What kind of god do you have then? The Germans never spare ammunition. They fire and fire. Our soldiers aren't waiting for death, but for the end of the shelling. You'd better shut up, infantryman, or you'll go before a tribunal for such opinions. Don't worry, gunner. Here's a little page from your own book. The Fritzes spotted the gleam of your spotter's stereoscope and gave a wallop to our trenches. They put an end to 4 of your guys, and I was practically buried alive. Only one of my legs was sticking above the ground, so they just managed to dig me out. There's something I don't understand, someone asks from the darkness. The Fritzes like to spout that they are fighting for their fatherland, but they are on our own Russian soil. Meanwhile, we are fighting for our own motherland, again on our own land, not on their territory. Who are they, the stinking worms, to consider our land as their own fatherland? Hey, you're talking like a fool, a neighbour laughs. Ask a commissar to answer your question. The nighttime free discussion continues. The soldiers, feeling no shyness in the presence of a junior lieutenant, turn to discussing their commanding officers. But they don't mention anyone higher than their company commander, for there are few who even know who commands their regiment or division. Our company commander is a brute. It's like he was born in the wild. One soldier couldn't stand it and punched his mug before the battle. I hope he's been taught a lesson on how to treat our guys properly. It seems our company commander thought it over and decided not to retaliate against even that fellow who struck him. Our company commander behaves disgracefully in the presence of his commander, just like he's ready to lick his arse. Our company commander isn't any better. He's crappy in action and not much better as a person. Our guy's a windbag, so we've nicknamed him Blah Blah. Our company commander gives such awkward orders that you're at a loss what to do. You can't figure out what he wants. As we arrived at the front, the commissars were telling us that we were going to drive the Fritzes. But in reality, unexpectedly, someone rushed up to the table in the darkness and thumped it with his fist so hard that he rattled the dishes on it. How are we supposed to take your words? You're wagging your tongues. A commander is a commander. You're defeatists. Such people should be put up against a wall and shot. A deathly quiet settled over the room. But it didn't last long, as the tanker retorted, Have you gone clean off your head? How are we defeatists? We've just come out of battle, and tomorrow we'll go right back into battle. We're only speaking in all fairness, that's all. But since you seem to be against this, go squeal to your friends in the special department. They love people like you, real idiots. As God is my witness, I won't have anything to do with that. I just became vexed as I listened to you badmouth your commanders. The neighbour of the angered soldier spoke up. Hey, Gerasha, those commanders forgive us. The junior lieutenant interrupted him. Guys, stop. Give a thought. Have none of you ever had even a single good commander? Everyone spoke up at once. Of course there were. But where can one find the best? They came and went. Hey, fellows. Everyone recognized the hoarse voice of the old soldier. What are you wagging your tongues about? You're just spreading dirt. Let me try to cheer you up if you don't mind. Go ahead, Lyosha. And Lyosha told us a story, just like a fairy tale. As has been said more than once, what doesn't happen in war. Here's how it was. How the greatest coward, born with a chicken heart, became hero of the Soviet Union. This case, how did it happen? This way, give a listen. The Germans were attacking Kiev and had us crushed up against the Dnepr River. From the entire regiment there only remained the regimental banner and Private Sidorenko. And it was bound to happen. The rabbit became a lion. This Sidorenko tied the banner around himself beneath his field shirt, found a log on the bank of the Dnepr that was a little longer and a little stronger than the others, and pushed it into the water. He then lay down and tightly strapped himself to the log, then started swimming that log with the current. The Germans were watching through binoculars, but they only saw a dead Ivan stuck to a log, floating down the river, and let him go. Sidorenko clung tightly to the log in the water so he wouldn't drown. He floated down the Dnepr all night, and the next day reached the bank, where one of our other units was defending the river. They dragged the soldier out of the water, asking, "Who is this?" And Sidorenko, the son of a bitch, is not a fellow to miss an opportunity. He's a real storyteller. "Private Sidorenko reporting," he says, "from such and such regiment of such and such division." Just before his death, the regiment commander Ivan Ionovich Bukin handed me the regimental banner and said, "I'm entrusting you, soldier, to save the honour of the regiment." I quickly thought what I should do. In a flash, I clambered down to the river, grabbed a log and started swimming. "And where is this banner?" some officers asked him. The soldier shrugged off his wet field blouse and handed the banner over to them. What a hero! They sent a report up to the division. The division sent a report up to the army, and from there to the front command. This headquarters was now not far from Moscow, and they informed the People's Defense Commissariat about the episode. Stalin ordered that the feat of this Russian man should be glorified and written about in all the newspapers. Our Sidorenko became Senior Sergeant Sidorenko, hero of the Soviet Union. You call it a case? No, brothers, it is fate. God just had a little joke on us with this drama unfolded. And where is your Sidorenko now? Who knows? Everything I saw and heard here, this assembly of human characters, fates and stories, was like a kaleidoscope. My encounters with other frontline soldiers enabled me to present a more complete picture of the battles for Rzhev in the winter and summer of 1942. Whenever I looked into it later and thought over some of its details, I often felt out of sorts. It is difficult to believe that such things ever happened. These memories troubled me for a long time. Another week passed quietly. One evening, as I was strolling with Sasha through the village, we spotted high, open trestles just beyond the far outskirts of the village. The trestles were supporting knocked-out tanks. "Our sepulchral neighbour," Rizi gloomily muttered. "Who could guess that some idiot would think to place a tank repair shop next to an infirmary?" Rizhikov's sense of foreboding didn't mislead us. The day started normally. We got up, washed and smoked a little while we waited for breakfast. The field kitchen was supposed to arrive at any moment. Suddenly, a quintet of Junkers appeared above the woods. They were flying low, skimming the treetops. Then they climbed high into the sky, and as we watched, they arranged themselves into a chain. That meant that in another minute or two, they would start their sinister round dance. I gave Rizzi a little push. "Quickly into the woods!" He didn't budge. "Don't worry," he replied. "They haven't come for us. Obviously, their reconnaissance spotted the repair facility, our dear neighbours." I didn't stop to hear him out, but rushed together with the others into the forest. The attack continued for about 15 minutes. When we returned to the village, everything around was smoking and in flames. There was a smell of burning, and where our 3 huts had stood, now deep bomb craters yawned, full of debris and rubble. Everything that had been in the huts, our bags, our everyday items, our coats, everything had either burned or lay scattered about, tossed by the blast waves. But where was Rizzi? Many of the shelters in which wounded men took cover had suffered direct hits. 7 new arrivals and about 24 convalescing men received fresh wounds, some of which were more severe than those that had brought them here. The battalion commander Tokmakov, a doctor's assistant, and a nurse were all dead. They had dashed out of their hut too late. A pilot in one of the Junkers had spotted the fleeing group and stitched all 3 with one burst of machine gun fire. I asked everyone I saw lingering around the crater of our hut, but I didn't find any trace of Rizai. He had seemingly vanished. That evening, one of the wounded soldiers, named Kirill, approached me. "Your friend is over there," and he waved his hand at a nearby ravine. I rushed over to the ravine. I found Rizai lying at the bottom of it. He was dead. A powerful blast wave had flung him onto some large, sharp rocks that lay scattered on the sides and bottom of the ravine. His face was all bloody, and he was lying on his back with a shattered head. I had to find his home address. I searched the contents of his pockets, but didn't find one. In the pocket of his field shirt, I found a worn, folded sheet of paper. It was a poem by Ehrenberg that he had cut out of a paper. It seems Sasha had liked it, and he carefully kept it. It turned out that the lines were about that which was lying now before me on the ground. A dead man, his corpse lying on its back, tossed here by some pitiless force. What did he die for? He can't answer you. And if you think you hear something, it's the wind. He died. So that the thick grass here is more vibrant, so that you are crying, which means you are alive. So that there is the rustling of a densely foliaged tree. So that there is the subtle Russian charm. So that to the four corners of the earth. However far you may walk, wherever you may meet someone with a better voice, more smartly dressed or richer, but there is no one like the one over whom you now cry. I asked Kirill to help me. We found a shovel and began to dig a grave for Sasha. The work went slowly. The ground was hard and rocky, and with just one shovel for the both of us, we laboured in turns to prepare the grave. Then, suddenly, without a word, Kirill began to pull Rizai's boots off his feet. "What are you doing?" I asked in confusion. "Just what it looks like I'm doing. I want to exchange my stinking puttees for these excellent boots. It seems they're my size." "Don't you know what they call what you're doing?" "So I've been informed. It's just that your friend doesn't really care now, does he?" Anger boiled up inside me, but I managed to restrain myself. I tried to appeal to his feelings. "Kirill, I implore you, let's bury the cadet properly. We're not animals." "What do you want from me? I found him, and I'm giving you help. You, brother, don't know what war is. I've had my fill of it." He made a slashing motion across his throat with his hand. "You don't know anything. We're worse than animals. This war will not let go of us before it has finished us off, so let me just walk a little while in normal boots." "No!" I shouted. "You don't have the right to plunder my comrade. We're from the same barracks." And swinging my arm, I punched him in the face with all my might. He grabbed the shovel, but then he stumbled, fell, hopped back to his feet, picked up the shovel again, and, his face distorted by anger, came at me with a roar. "I'm going to kill you!" "Kill me then! But they sent you to the front to kill fascists!" I managed to shout. Stopping short, he became flustered. He spat, threw the shovel at my feet, turned around, and stalked off into the forest. Shaking all over, I stood next to Rizai's body. I buried my friend alone. Saying goodbye to him, I audibly offered a prayer. "We're from the same barracks." So one more grave mound had risen. How many of them appeared during the war? Yet then they disappeared without a trace, just like the memory of those people. On the eve before my return to the front lines, I went to say goodbye again to Rizai, and couldn't find the gravesite. All the ground around had been freshly turned over by someone's cold, spiteful hands. To this day, I keep that poem from the newspaper, which Rizai had carefully preserved, as a memento of my uncompromising and talented friend. Perhaps his favourite guitar, which he had left on the transport unit before the battle, still remains and continues to sing in someone's caring hands. A short distance from our lodging at the infirmary was located a modest veterinary clinic, a few tents, and, beyond a low little fence, a few kennels. We had been warned not to go there, for it was a closed zone. Sometimes at night we could hear the dogs barking. During the air attack, 2 of the wounded dogs had been killed. Their caretaker, a medical orderly, like all of us who were living in the village, had run into the forest to escape the attack and had abandoned his charges. Some of the men rebuked him for this, but the majority justified his decision. What else could he do? He wouldn't have had enough time to save them. That evening, the head of the army's special dog unit came galloping up to us. He had found out what had happened, and he brusquely asked, "Where is this swine who abandoned the 2 wounded dogs?" The junior lieutenant frustrated his evident intentions. "He's dead!" Everyone held their tongue so as not to blow the cover story. The dog chief was named Collier. We offered him some tea, gave him something to eat, and calmed him down. He told us that the 30th Army had recently created the first special unit for dogs. They carried out a variety of roles at the front, such as medical assistance, communications, and tank destroyers. We listened to Collier all through the night, and he told us about how they trained the demolition dogs. They would tie small packs onto the backs of the dogs and train them to crawl under a tank. Before a German tank attack, they would replace the pack with an explosive charge and a trigger. Of course, it was a bad thing for the dogs, who were blown up together with the German tanks, but the enemy had to be stopped and destroyed at all cost. The Germans feared these dogs even more than our own human tank hunters. They hunted them, deployed snipers against them, and even created a reward for each dead dog. Early the next morning, without even stopping for a bite of breakfast, the dog chief returned to his special unit. Within a short time, it became known that the special unit had been transformed into a special regiment in the 30th Army. Soon after the German air raid, we were transferred to a different village. At the beginning of October, during the routine rewrapping of my bandages, the nurse joyfully informed me that the infection had subsided. "You're healthy, soldier." A few days later, I received a new assignment. I left the convalescent battalion sadly, if only because I was parting from many good people. Some came, some left, but each left an imprint of his personality and personal story on my soul. Meeting with them, I came to understand frontline life better and saw, it seemed to me, what was most important in it. As it happened, I didn't return to my regiment or even my former division or army. From the convalescent battalion, I was sent to the 673rd Rifle Regiment of the 31st Army's 220th Rifle Division. On the paper that I received, it was written that I was to report to the commander of the 673rd Rifle Regiment, Nikolai Ivanovich Glukov. I served in this regiment until July 1944. At the headquarters of the 673rd Rifle Regiment, I, still a sergeant but a former cadet, was appointed platoon leader and sent immediately to the front lines, to the battalion of Senior Lieutenant Malishev, which was defending a suburban forest on the northeast outskirts of Rzhev. Before I left, my destination was indicated on a map, and I was warned that it was only possible to reach the front lines at night, since during the daylight hours the Germans kept the entire area under fire. Moreover, German airplanes often appeared, looking for targets, and if they noticed something living, they'd try to kill it. I waited for night and then headed on my way. It was hard to imagine worse weather. Cold, tedious autumn rains fell day after day, with a biting wind. I travelled through an area that had seen heavy fighting but was now not being contested. Here, close to the forest, the ancient road to Tver passed through. Now bombarded again and heavily cratered, the road was all potholed and overgrown by weeds and wildflowers. For the entire distance of my journey, along the sides of the road, in ditches and shell holes, lay piles of corpses in the most diverse poses, both our guys and Germans, all mixed together. They had lain here uncollected since summer. Evidently the cold clay soil had preserved the dead bodies from complete decomposition. When I entered the forest, all shattered by shells, I began to perceive the terrible testimony to the current fighting. I could dimly make out in the darkness the fallen trunks of trees, the enormous piles of tangled roots torn from the ground, the shattered skeletons of burned-out tanks and military vehicles, and more corpses upon corpses. I nevertheless managed to pick my way through the complete darkness to the battalion and reported to Senior Lieutenant Malishev. The battalion commander was a little bit drunk, but he greeted me affably. As I understood, he had already received notice of my pending arrival from the regiment. Our meeting was brief, and he only asked, "This means you're the cadet, Sergeant?" "Precisely so." This means you've already been in battle and already been wounded. Precisely so. Okay, we'll have a chat later. Right now, I want you to go into the trenches and take over your platoon. It's not really a platoon, but one of the remnants of my battalion. It's practically the only combat strength I have left. When we broke through to Rjev, we had practically 300 men. But after that damned night of the 2nd of October, I was left with just 62 men. The most important thing, platoon leader, is to maintain communications with your neighbours and me. I can't think of anything else right now. The situation is complicated. If you have to, resist to the last man, and don't count on any help, as there is no one left to fight. The conversation was over. It was alarming and rather unpleasant. I set off for my platoon. The platoon occupied about 200 metres of the front. It was just about as far to the enemy lines, in some places a bit closer, in others a bit farther. Once I presented myself to the platoon, I contacted the battalion commander by phone and told him I had taken over the platoon, and then I began to acquaint myself with the men and our situation. There were about 20 of us. We were a completely international group. 10 Russians, 3 Ukrainians, 2 Uzbeks, a Belarusian, a Kyrgyz, a Tatar, a Mordvinian and a Jew, me. Curiously, the Mordvinian turned out to be Mavri. I didn't recognize him at first when he presented himself. He was filthy, with reddened eyes from lack of sleep and a heavy overgrowth of beard. But as always, he was handsome, with a little smile on his face. "Mavri, how did you wind up in this place?" "Like everyone else, so here we are. In my sleep, the Supreme Being appeared right here in our trench and appealed to me. Fight honourably, Mavri. Save Mother Russia. She is dying. I killed 2 Germans on that October night." Pleased with himself, Mavri gave a laugh. Again this October battle. Everybody kept referring to it. But that would have to wait. Right now, I carefully looked Mavri over, recalling our first meeting. Not much time had passed since then, but so much had changed, and so much had we experienced. People had changed too, and become completely different. Mavri was no longer that fledgling who had landed next to Yurka and me on that first day at the front. At that time it had seemed combat would not be easy for him, but war is a quick teacher, and now his faith was even helping him. "You've changed greatly, Mavri." "I'm still what I was, a Christian. I somehow make sense of all this. War is completely godless. Neither the 10 Commandments nor the Almighty recognize it. Having witnessed such mass murder, I found my place in it. When I shot the first guy, I was tormented and begged for mercy for the sin I had committed. But now I've gotten used to it, for war doesn't happen without killing." Again Mavri had surprised me. He was almost illiterate, yet his mind never seemed to stop working, and he tried to get to the essence of every matter. Even now I agree with Mavri. War is the greatest evil ever conceived by the human beast against God and against humanity. "Mavri, what happened to your platoon?" "From my platoon, only Kishmek and I remain. The rest, the Germans killed them, and now they're all stars in the heavens. That's what I think, and you know it too." "You've become real sharp, Mavri, and obviously a sensible soldier. We, the men of Vyatskaya Oblast, now Kirovskaya Oblast, are loyal patriots." And he suddenly raised his rifle above the parapet and took a shot at the enemy across the way. The platoon received me respectfully. Nobody asked me about anything, probably relying on the cruelest bit of soldier's wisdom. If we live, we'll see. Almost all of my men had already passed, as they say, through fire and water, but among them as well were a few men of my own draft class, who, like me, had less than a year of service at the front. We all quickly got used to each other. Before my appointment, Sergeant Pavel Ivanov had been commanding the platoon. Now he became my deputy. When we first met each other, I quickly thought that Pavel would have been a better choice for platoon commander than me. He had a lot of combat experience, and he was physically stronger than me. He had been wounded twice and been awarded the medal for courage. Unfortunately, when Pasha, as we called him, was worried, he stuttered, which is possibly the reason why higher command didn't want to risk naming him platoon leader. Pasha told me that the battalion, the remnant of which I was now commanding as a platoon, had been considered a special one in the regiment. Quite recently, Victor Gastello, the younger brother of the legendary pilot hero Nikolai Gastello, had commanded it. But alas, he didn't have command for long. Victor Gastello had arrived near Rjev at the beginning of August with the rank of lieutenant, and he became the battalion commander. He was a brave and competent commander, and his battalion was one of the first to reach the outskirts of Rjev. But while storming the city, he was killed by a sniper's bullet. The regiment commander appointed Malishev in his place.